when the first frost curled around the eaves of a colonial American home, it wasn't just a matter of turning up the thermostat, because of course, thermostats hadn't been invented or even imagined. What did exist, however, was a curious mix of ingenuity, stubbornness, and layers, so many layers of wool. Surviving winter in colonial America wasn't about thriving. It was about getting through it with fewer frostbitten toes this year than last, and hopefully keeping all your livestock alive and yourself only mildly smoked from indoor fires. Most homes were single-room affairs, a sort of open-concept studio apartment with a fireplace, an occasional lofted sleeping area, and zero insulation. The wind outside made itself known indoors, whispering theatrical flourishes through every chink and seam in the wooden walls. If they had cork, they used it liberally. If they didn't, well, someone would invent it later, and for now, they were content stuffing moss between the cracks and calling it a day. In place of modern heating systems, they cherished what we might refer to as fire-based desperation. By November, a large hearth roared at all hours, the beating heart of the home. It wasn't simply a place to simmer stew or dry socks. No, the fireplace was a multi-purpose miracle. Oven, source of light, heat regulator, headline act, and sometimes reluctant smoke detector. You knew someone meant business when they constructed a beehive oven, a dome-shaped brick enclosure right within the fireplace, perfect for baking bread and warming pies. But more often than not, cooking was somewhat of a roulette game between undercooked, on fire, and slightly smokier than necessary. Meals were mostly determined by what hadn't rotted yet. Preservation techniques were basic but effective: salting, drying, and pickling. Winter came with a never-ending rotation of stews. Cabbage, into the pot. Bits of last week's bacon, absolutely. Questionable root vegetable dug from under the porch. In it goes. Sometimes it resembled soup. Sometimes it resembled a dare. People didn't venture out unless absolutely necessary. That was usually limited to chopping firewood or chasing away wolves with loud shouting and questionable courage. Roads, if you could call them that, turned to slush pits or crisp channels of ice, and horses were not keen on either. Travel slowed to a halt, which honestly provided a great excuse to not visit your neighbor, Hezekiah, who always asked for eggs but never gave any back. Clothing became a kind of architectural challenge. The more layers, the better. Wool was the fabric of both fashion and survival. Flannel shirts, woolen drawers, thick stockings, and what can only be described as blanket-inspired outerwear emerged from trunks each fall. Men wore coats so broad they could double as tents, and women wrapped themselves in shawls and cloaks that would start small fires if they got too close to the hearth. Children, being immensely portable, were frequently bundled until they resembled rye loaves with feet. Sleeping arrangements were an adventure in proximity. Entire families piled into one bed to stay warm, often sleeping so cozily close to each other that individual dreams had to be scheduled. Most beds were feather-filled and had bed warmers, lovely contraptions in which embers were shoveled into lidded pans and swished under the covers, hopefully without lighting the mattress. For the less fortunate, heated stones wrapped in cloth served the same role. Rest assured, no feet went warm for long. You shifted often in your sleep, if only to rotate which limb had gone numb from the cold. Books, precious, candles, rationed. You didn't read at night unless it was by firelight, and even then, only if your eyes were young or you were very committed to squinting. Winter was less about entertainment and more about waiting out the cold with a mix of patience, prayer and knitting projects that grew sentient by February. Yet, for all its discomforts, there was a deep simplicity to it. The rhythm of chopping, cooking, mending, and occasionally marveling at a perfectly symmetrical icicle. Evenings were filled with quiet industriousness, family huddles, and the kind of silence that modern life has mostly misplaced. And outside, always, was the crunch of snow underfoot, the eternal hush of trees slumbering under frost, and a sky so full of stars it could make your teeth ache from looking up too long. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, hush. It's still winter outside. Let's stay by the fire just a little longer. As winter's breath curled icy fingers around the wooden corners of Colonial America, the seasoned, frost-bitten inhabitants of a modest settlement in New England, say about 17 people named John, prepared for what they hoped would be a survivable few months. Winter was not a cute season then. There were no fuzzy fleece PJ sets or social media posts about artisanal marshmallows. Survival was less about aesthetic, more about not freezing to death while praying your last jar of pickled turnips didn't explode. First order of business, sealing up the house. When we say house, let's be generous. The average colonial home was a drafty, one-room wooden box with more smoke than privacy. Cracks in the walls invited wind as eagerly as modern hosts invite drama at dinner parties. So, settlers stuffed every gap they could find with moss, mud, old rags, or on particularly desperate days, last year's copies of the town crier's announcements. These makeshift insulators earned the informal title of wicking, which sounds cozy, like a candle, but mostly just meant stuffing things in holes and hoping for the best. Speaking of candles, let's dim the light and imagine one now, flickering gently, the smell of tallow lingering in the air. That's not your neighborhood boutique blend of cinnamon and cedar. That's beef fat, lovingly rendered down into waxy utility. Tallow candles were cheap, common, and smelled like beef fat on fire. Delightful. Only the wealthiest households used beeswax, which smelled sweeter and gave a clearer flame, what we modern softies would call mood lighting premium. But what really kept folks going wasn't candles or wicking. It was the hearth, the beating, sooty heart of every home. A massive fireplace, big enough to roast an entire pig, or at least lose several spoons in. This fireplace was kitchen, furnace, dryer, and closest thing to central heating they'd ever know. Getting close to it was heavenly. Walking away felt like jumping into a snowbank, naked, with your dignity bundled under your arm. Now, not everyone had logs aplenty. Wood had to be chopped, seasoned, and stacked, a process that began months earlier in the fall, ideally before someone's arm gave out or the axe handle broke for the third time. Men, women, and even children. Yes, even tiny Sarah, who was 5 and emotionally attached to her rag doll, took turns splitting firewood, making it the colonial equivalent of family bonding. Those who failed to do enough chopping by October were often left bartering valuable things for a few branches. One historical account involves a man trading a whole smoked raccoon for a half log of oak. Was it a good deal? Debatable. The raccoon may have been imaginary. But winter wasn't just about staying warm. It was about staying alive within the psychological tundra of cabin fever. Imagine, you, 7 other family members, your neighbor's cousin who just needed a place to crash, and a goat, all confined to 10 square feet of wooden flooring for 4 months. It was intimate. Privacy was fictional, bathing was optional. Personal boundaries? Not invented yet. To pass the time, colonists did things we now associate with retro youth camp. There were stories told by firelight, some educational, some terrifying, and some made up entirely just to amuse the children. Fiddle music lilted through the smoky air, and if you were really lucky, someone had a set of bones, literal animal bones used as percussion instruments. Perhaps grandma had rhythm. Knitting, mending, and making things were also part of daily life. Scarves needed lengthening, socks needed darning, and even the concept of a quilt square found its way into long winter hours. One might not consider embroidery thrilling, but when your only other option is watching a potato sprout from storage, needlework becomes wildly compelling. Food, of course, was both an obsession and an art. Whatever was cured, dried, smoked, or pickled had to be carefully rationed. Salt pork and hard biscuits made frequent appearances, as did mush. Lots of mush, cornmeal mush, oat mush, pea mush, essentially anything that could become vaguely mush-shaped. Flavor was optional, survival was not. But despite the smoke in their eyes and the turnip in their mouths, people found humor too. Jokes kept spirits afloat, like the old standby. Why did the chicken refuse to cross the snow? Because it froze halfway. Did it make them laugh? Possibly not. But when your toes are purple and your food is beige, you take what you can get. And so, curtains of snow fell gently outside their crooked windows, muffling the world. Inside, the colonists leaned into each other for warmth. Physically, yes, but also emotionally, finding flickers of joy and resilience among the embers. As the wind whispered through the dark treetops and the fire cracked with sleepy rhythm, one might begin to wonder, how do you survive winter without a stove? But that's a tale best saved for another quiet night. Life slowed noticeably as December's breath settled over the colonies, blanketing the countryside in a stubborn hush. Snow weighed heavy on the thatched roofs, smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys, and squirrels, who are perhaps history's most underappreciated meteorologists, stayed curled in their dens, betting rightly that man and beast alike would soon be wondering what on earth had possessed them not to migrate south. Inside a modest colonial homestead, winter survival was less a matter of drama and more a matter of very creative boredom. Most days blurred together in a potpourri of careful rationing, relentless wool layering, and occasional outbursts of bread making. The average family passed the darkest months comforted by the company of glowing hearths, overused hand tools, and stories that may or may not have been entirely true. Food, not surprisingly, held center stage in the theater of survival. If you were among the luckier farmers or the more paranoid planners, you had a root cellar stocked with potatoes, turnips, and other subterranean edibles that preferred being buried. These cellars were cool but not freezing, damp but not soggy, and gave colonial Americans the rare gift of choice. Would you care for mashed potatoes or mashed turnips this evening? A thrilling decision, second only to, do we still have any salt pork left? Salt pork, for the uninitiated, was bacon's rougher, harder cousin. It didn't pretend to be fancy. It boasted no smoke rings or social grace. It was pork that had been bathed in salt so aggressively that it could survive a nuclear winter, and possibly a third reheating. Early Americans used it in everything from soup to stew, and if you were especially crafty, you'd dice a little into your Johnny cakes, small cornmeal pancakes that might pass for cheerful if you squinted. Now, meat wasn't guaranteed. Hunting in winter ranged from challenging to Guess we're vegetarians now. Game had either migrated or hunkered down deep in the woods, and those intrepid enough to go after it had to contend with snowdrifts taller than a toddler and temperatures unforgiving enough to snap bowstrings. Trapping, on the other hand, was slightly more plausible. Snares for rabbits, deadfalls for squirrels, anything that might wander too close to curiosity and meet a culinary fate. It wasn't glamorous, but it was protein. And let us not forget the quiet heroism of early food preservation. In a world before refrigeration and after reason, colonists leaned heavily on salting, drying, smoking, and the good old put it outside and hope it freezes method. Ice boxes weren't boxes of ice. They were wooden cupboards placed in the coldest part of the house, sometimes outdoors, sometimes on the north-facing wall near a window, and often the favourite haunt of ambitious raccoons. Water, meanwhile, required nothing less than commitment. Streams froze over, and no one had taps to turn or pipes to burst. So families dutifully hacked through the ice each morning, ladle in one hand, existential dread in the other. A wooden bucket filled, sloshed, and was carried back inside with a reverence usually reserved for saints. The hearth, that faithful fireplace, did more than warm the room. It anchored the household. Above it hung cast iron pots, blackened and seasoned by generations of soup. These cauldrons weren't emptied so much as perpetually added to. A bit of cabbage here, the heel of a loaf there, salt pork for luck. If you were lucky, tonight's dinner would vaguely taste like last night's dinner. If not, you added more salt and hoped. Lighting was precious, but unpredictable. Candles were made from tallow, rendered animal fat, a process requiring patience, endurance, and a high tolerance for smell. Beeswax was preferred but expensive, which meant most homes glowed not with honeyed light, but with flickering stink. Reading by candlelight was possible, sure, if you had candles to spare and eyeballs unbothered by strain. Storytelling was far more popular. Tales passed down from grandparents who had, by sheer stubbornness, outlived several winters and most of their teeth. Every family had at least one tale like that. The time the stew caught fire. The time a neighbour swore he saw a snow bear the size of a barn. The time someone mistakenly salted the tea, then politely drank it anyway out of sheer winter-induced politeness. These stories fed the soul, even when the pantry couldn't. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, people gathered, under quilts, near flames, beside tin lanterns emitting the softest orange glow. Another day survived. Another meal, of dubious texture but passionate preparation, completed. Somewhere in the rafters, the wind sighed like an old horse, and the house creaked thoughtfully in reply. And by that dim, gentle light, we tiptoe forward into the next layer of winter life, where even the simplest act, like staying warm, had its rituals, its risks, and the occasional surprise. Wherever the cold winds blew and the icicles clung lovingly to the corners of thatched roofs, you could be certain that somewhere someone in colonial America was squinting at a potato and whispering, "Well, you again." Because in the land before microwaves and fuzzy fleece onesies, survival meant getting creative with whatever root vegetable hadn't given up the will to live. By the time winter settled in, like a grouchy relative who overstayed their welcome, the diet of a colonial family shifted into something best described as reluctantly rustic. Before the snow, during the golden season of stocking up known politely as autumn, and less politely as, "Oh no, we're out of salt again," entire households would be bustling with the noble art of food preservation. Salting, drying, pickling, smoking. anything to make food last longer than your average 18th century lifespan. The vegetable cellar, which sounded charming, but was more often just a hole in the ground that occasionally made eye contact with a confused mole, became the pantry of dreams. There, nestled in barrels and baskets, were turnips with questionable social skills, carrots as crooked as a tavern tail, onions potent enough to make a bear weep, and perhaps, if the season had been kind, a precious apple or two, kept in sawdust like culinary treasure. Now, let's talk about cooking, although one does hesitate to dignify the act of boiling a turnip for 6 hours as cooking. Firewood was precious. Gathering it often meant trudging through snow like a very determined sledless Santa. So meals had to be practical and fill every possible belly at once. Soups, stews, and what was lovingly referred to as mush were common fare. Mush was exactly what it sounded like, a warm, greyish mixture of cornmeal and water that stuck to your ribs, and sometimes your walls, if flung during a family disagreement. Still, food scarcity had a way of fostering community, or at least grudging cooperation between neighbours who might otherwise purse their lips about your overly loud butter churning. It wasn't unusual for families to share their preserved goods or bake together in large batches. One family might have onions, another had pork. Put them together, and you had yourself a social stew, complete with local gossip and the occasional unsolicited hymn. Among the most prized provisions was salted meat, especially pork, which was often cured in salt and hung from ceiling beams, not as a decoration, but because nothing said homey like a ham swinging above your bed. With the salt levels these meats contained, one could age several decades just looking at them. Bacon grease, by the way, was a currency of its own. It flavoured food, lubricated hinges, and provided light. Yes, bacon fat lamps were a thing. You haven't lived until your reading light smells vaguely of breakfast. Colonists also leaned heavily on their baked goods to get through the long winter evenings. Dense breads made from coarse flours lasted longer, but required teeth with the strength of blacksmiths. If there was any molasses in the house, a rare luxury, it would find its way into gingerbread or thick cakes, which were best enjoyed in small bites and preferably early in the season, before they began to conspire with local wildlife for their eventual escape. And what of the drinks, you ask? Hot beverages were prized, though colonial cocoa was more of a cocoa's distant pen pal, thin, a bit gritty, and made with questionable water. Most families relied on herbal teas. Well, they called them teas. We might call them something hot steeped in desperation. Sprigs of mint, pieces of bark, or any leaf that didn't fight back might end up in the pot. On especially festive nights, cider, fermented for extra cheer, was passed around, warming mouths and occasionally provoking spontaneous renditions of sea shanties their coastal ears barely understood. But beyond food and drink, winter was about preserving not only bodies but spirits. These long, bitter months bred ingenuity, resilience, and more than a few heavy woolen emergencies. And while their bellies might not have always been full, their sense of humour, surprisingly, tended to be. As wind whispered outside their wooden walls and snow danced politely past the windows, families would huddle in kitchens and corners, bellies warmed by broth, company, and stories passed down. Some true, some aspirational. And while food could be rationed, warmth hoarded, and fires stoked, there was another challenge lurking beneath every drafty floorboard and behind every frostbitten shutter. How in the world to stay adequately warm when insulation was more wishful thinking than architectural reality? Against the snow-draped backdrop of a colonial winter, the flicker of a hearth was more than just romantic imagery. It was survival, style, and social status, all bundled up in one slightly smoky package. You see, fireplaces in the 1700s were the beating heart of the home, and occasionally, the chief offender in a series of mysterious smoke inhalations. But all drama aside, that humble fireplace was the center stage around which daily life revolved. From cooking to warming to, let's be honest, standing very, very close to it and pretending you had important wood stacking duties. Colonial Americans didn't mess around when it came to firewood. They were intimately acquainted with two truths. Winter was long, and trees were plentiful. Gathering firewood wasn't exactly a scenic hobby. It was grueling labor, but it had a poetic rhythm of its own. You weren't just chopping down a tree. You were essentially pre-ordering warmth for January. If you were wise, you planned way ahead, cutting and stacking logs during the summer when your fingers hadn't yet turned into icy carrots. A properly prepared family might stock up cords of wood, carefully arranged in towering stacks outside, like nature's version of a lumber Jenga. Oak, hickory, and maple were prized choices, dense, slow-burning, and delightfully aromatic if you ignored the occasional surprise squirrel. Now, heating efficiency wasn't exactly their strong suit. Most colonial fireplaces were shallow and wide, great for roasting things, but about as effective for heating an entire house as lighting a candle in a tornado. The warm air escaped straight up the chimney, possibly waving at you on its way out. Benjamin Franklin, who had a deeply personal relationship with uncomfortable winters, invented the Franklin stove in the 1740s. It was supposed to save heat and lives, but early versions had a bit of a complicated relationship with working. Still, it was better than huddling hopelessly over the open hearth, praying the wind didn't change direction and send smoke directly into your eyeballs. As the sun dipped behind crooked branches and the land stiffened with frost, colonial folks retreated indoors, often gathering in rooms so cold you could see your breath. Blankets helped, woolen, thick, and sometimes scratchier than a cat with bad manners. Beds were stuffed with feather or corn husks, depending on your level of luxury or your tolerance for pokey surprises. And then there was the bed warmer, a curious instrument of nightly ritual. Imagine a metal pan on a long handle, filled with hot coals, slid rhythmically between the cold, cruel sheets. The goal was to trick your bed into pretending it wasn't made of ice cubes. Of course, one had to be careful, lest your humble, hay-stuffed mattress decide to catch fire and declare itself a sacrificial offering to the god of warmth. Still, physical heat was only half the battle. Psychological warmth played its part. Colonial American homes weren't just drafty. They were dramatically eloquent in their drafting. To combat this, people layered themselves like onions with opinions. Wool on wool, cloaks over caps, mittens over dreams. Children often wore mittens to sleep, and not just for cozy vibes. Their breath would freeze on the bed linens overnight, forming tiny rhyme tapestries of misery. As for sleeping caps, essential, because nothing ruins beauty sleep like frost on your eyebrows. Let's not forget foot warmers, little wooden boxes filled with hot embers, tucked discreetly under dresses or cloaks. It made gatherings slightly more tolerable, though they also had the power to turn any church pew into a smoky, toe-roasting event. And if you lived in New England and were particularly unlucky, there was the dreaded nor'easter, which howled like an unpaid banshee through every crack and crevice of your painstakingly patched house. But even in the bleakest February hours, there was beauty. Shadows danced across cabin walls while snowflakes whispered secrets against windows made from oiled paper or thin glass, depending on your socio-economic luck. Candles flickered, stories were told, popcorn popped near. The fire, not the pre-packaged kind, mind you, but honest kernels launched serenely in iron kettles. And above all, families sat close, bundled in warmth and weariness, forming a human cocoon against the cold. And so, while fireplaces may have belched smoke and roofs dripped with icicles that resembled the swords of frost giants, colonial families found ways to survive, wrapped in wool, soaked in determination, and warmed, in part, by each other's company. In the hush of the hearth's dying crackle, as the coal began its nightly siege, they held fast to their little rituals, and tomorrow, with all its frozen troubles, could wait. Soon, we'll venture again into those frostbitten times, where survival was stitched into socks and whispered over simmering stew. Even in the deepest pockets of the colonial wilderness, where trees outnumbered people, and the wind had a personal grudge against every chimney, there was one constant companion during winter: smoke. Not just from the hearth, though that was certainly billowing at all times, but from the never-ending stream of clove-scented gossip and various things being smoked: meat, fish, pipe tobacco, and sometimes socks, if you hung them too close to the fire. As the air grew colder, so did the ability of homes to keep anything warm other than the inch of air directly next to the fireplace. Colonial homes, particularly the early ones, leaked heat like a bucket with 1,000 holes. Insulation, in the modern sense, would have been as foreign a concept as electric blankets or taxes that came with representation. So the colonists had their own methods of heat preservation. Let us take a sleepy glance at the humble bed warmer. Far from being a kindly old woman with a kindling personality, a bed warmer was a metal pan with a long wooden handle, essentially a medieval popcorn popper. Coals from the fire were scooped into the pan, which was then gingerly slipped between the bed sheets to warm things up before sleep. It was both practical and a potential fire hazard, depending entirely on how drowsy, clumsy, or reckless the user was. For those less inclined to play fire tag under the covers, there were heated stones placed in wool pouches or foot warmers made of tin, filled with hot ash, and then tucked into the foot of the bed. These makeshift heating devices were a decent substitute for central heating, and retained as much elegance as could be expected from a box of embers tucked between your ankles. Sleeping, in general, was a team sport during winter. Families often bunked together, not out of affection, though hopefully that helped, but because body heat was one of the few reliable heat sources available. Feather beds and woolen coverlets piled as high as the roof beams were the mark of a smart sleeper. Forget duvets. This was the era of quilt stacking, the great American pastime before baseball. By the time you squeezed under your 11th layer of calico, you might not be able to move your arms, but you'd be toasty and miraculously preserved, like a bread loaf in a hot brick oven. Let's not overlook the nightcap, not the kind you sip, though colonial folks did enjoy a medicinal tipple now and then, but the literal hat one wore to bed. Wool or flannel, long and pointy. These sleeping hats weren't a fashion statement. They were essential heat keepers. After all, it was widely believed that much of the body's warmth escaped through the head. Whether or not that's scientifically accurate, there was little harm in sleeping like a medieval wizard if it meant not waking up with icicles in your eyebrows. But human warmth was only part of the battle. Windows, not yet blessed with double glazing, were drafty gaps that allowed wind to whistle through at night like a ghost with a flute lesson. To combat this, colonists hung heavy curtains, sometimes called bed hangings, around beds. These created a cozy pocket of warmth and blocked out both cold air and occasionally wandering glances from the 12 other people sharing your one-room home. In the kitchen, where the hearth roared proudly day and night, colonists made clever use of the residual warmth. Some baked bread not just to eat, but to warm. Loaves removed from the oven were pressed briefly to cold fingers, bellies, and even elbows, anywhere desperate for a smidge of heat. And it must be said, there are few things finer than being warmed by something you can snack on afterward. But perhaps the most curious and quietly delightful winter tradition was lighting the candle and sharing stories by the fireside. After all the chores had been done, the livestock fed and the snow brushed off boots that had more holes than leather, families gathered by the hearth. Here, legends were passed on. Songs were sung in voices that danced between gentle yawns, and silence was comfortable, even sweet. In the crackle of fire and the slow melting of candle wax, winter didn't seem so fearsome. It simply curled up like everyone else, wrapped in a patchwork quilt of memory and laughter. And just as the candle sputters in its final struggle before going dark, one can imagine the soft hush that fell over the household. Fire dimmed, breath even, dreams inching in through the rafters. The snow lay deep outside, but will stay inside just a little longer, as a new scent, perhaps dried herbs tucked in the rafters, prepares to lead us into the next gentle custom of colonial winter life. As the wind howled through the skeletal trees outside, colonial families turned to an unlikely hero in the war against winter's chill. The onion. Yes, the onion. In kitchens and pantries across New England, these tear-inducing bulbs were more than just culinary cheat sheets. They were natural preservatives, vitamin guards, and, on especially brisk evenings, potential hand warmers. You see, in a world without central heating or flu medicine, onions had a much higher reputation. Slice a raw, bun and hang it near the door, and voila, evil spirits, disease, and unwanted cousins were all believed to stay away by sheer olfactory force. Whether this worked or merely gave visitors a strong reason to stay outside, historians remain undecided. Next to the onions on the pantry shelf sat a lineup of other winter staples: barrels of salted pork, stacks of dried apples, jars of fermented whatever they could ferment. Cabbage rarely escaped its destiny of becoming sauerkraut. And yes, before refrigeration, fermentation was less of a trend and more of a social survival contract. Throughout the long winter days, families huddled close in the single-room heart of the home. The hearth, wide enough to roast a goat and your knees at the same time, blazed constantly, requiring logs that had been split and stacked under the tyranny of late summer necessity. These logs crackled now, sparking like tiny fireworks into the dark shadows of the cabin. Children entertained themselves with carved walnut dolls and the occasional impromptu indoor snowball fight using clothing scraps. "Don't waste the wool," a mother might shout, chasing a mischievous child swinging a sock-stuffed bundle meant to resemble a sheep. In fairness, when the outdoors is a frozen portrait and you're dressed in layers that resemble a well-padded scarecrow, imagination becomes your best indoor sport. The local minister, always good for an unannounced visit and a mildly alarming sermon on moral fortitude, might venture over during snowfall. He'd arrive wrapped in what seemed like the prolonged folds of a curtain, quoting psalms in between requests for second helpings of stew. His boots left great puddles of slush that froze again promptly by the door, forming miniature ice floes for unwary guests. The day's work didn't halt for snow, of course. Men trudged into the woods to fell trees or check on traps, a tradition equal parts survival and stubbornness. Trapping was an important winter economy, if only because beaver hats hadn't gone out of style yet. Somewhere, a fur trader named Giles was convincing people they needed 3 bear pelts and a raccoon muff to make it through March. Life indoors was guided by the rhythms of the daylight, which in January politely vanished by late afternoon. Candles were precious, and when the tallow ran low, most families shifted into early evening semi-hibernation. Reading by firelight wasn't for pleasure, it was for saints, and people who hadn't gone nearly blind trying to decipher scripture in minuscule print during a snowstorm. And yet, amid these long dark hours, there was a beautiful kind of intimacy. The room glowed with firelight, and smoke twisted toward rafters blackened by time. Needles clicked gently as someone mended a stocking. Quiet songs, slightly out of tune but warm with memory, drifted from shadowy corners. Pipes were passed among elders like sacred objects filled with gossip rather than tobacco. Sometimes, an elder might launch into a tale so sprawling and impossibly detailed that it effectively kept everyone too politely engaged to notice their socks had frozen to the floorboards. These stories, heavy with moral fables and suspiciously detailed barn owl dialogue, often revealed more imagination than fact, but they were warmth in their own right, stitched into the winter just as surely as any woolen quilt. The snow outside continued to fall. Flakes stuck to the tiny windows, the glass a smudged barrier between survival and hush. Colonial life in winter wasn't easy, but it knitted people together, literally and figuratively. Shared hardships became shared wisdom, and the ordinary, an onion, a hearth, a cracked mug of cider, shone with the quiet magic of endurance. And as another long night stretched its woolen arms over the settlement, something unseen shifted in the wind, the promise of longer days perhaps, or just the sound of something curious in the attic rafters, likely just a squirrel, or the focus of what came next, upstairs, among the shadows and the hidden things. There is something rather charming, if a little itchy, about wrapping one's entire lower body in homespun wool while attempting not to freeze inside a wooden box with a chimney. But such was winter fashion in 18th century colonial America, where survival wasn't just about boiling root vegetables. It was also about layering like your life depended on it, because it did. Let us picture a December dusk in a modest New England dwelling, perhaps along the outskirts of Boston, before Boston had quite figured out plumbing. The year is 1742. Snowflakes float quietly, as though trying not to disturb the serene gloom. Inside, the hearth bellies out a gentle fire, huffing and crackling like an old man telling a well-worn tale. The Baxter family, fictional, though likely less interesting than their real counterparts, circle around the fire. It's not so much a cozy living room gathering as it is tactical thermal positioning. The closer you sat to the fire, the less your toes resembled frozen beans. Of course, this delicate balance was disturbed every time the fire needed wood, which meant negotiating with the cold floor like it were a debt collector. Clothing in these wintry months did not so much involve fashion as it did fabric loyalty. Colonists wore layers, petticoats, shifts, breeches, wool stockings tight enough to strangle a calf, and if you were lucky, a gown or coat thick enough to bruise you with its warmth. These weren't your department store wools. No, these were family-woven affairs. often designed to accommodate growth, inheritance, and the occasional small rodent. Now, shoes were another matter entirely. Leather shoes stiffened in the cold like rebellious crusts of bread, especially if they'd soaked up any snow. So colonists developed creative strategies for winter foot treatment, such as stuffing the insides with hay or wrapping feet in cloth before putting on shoes. It was essentially colonial-era insulation, performed daily with all the romance of a greased sock. To maintain any level of warmth indoors, colonists didn't just rely on one fireplace. If you were wealthy, say the town's apothecary or a merchant, you might have two, perhaps one upstairs and one below, like a fiery duplex. But for the average homesteader, one hearth served all. Bedrooms upstairs went unheated, and people slept together in one bed, not solely for family camaraderie, but for the preservation of limbs. A family of 6, huddled beneath patchwork quilts, was less a Norman Rockwell tableau and more a necessity of climatological mathematics. And then there was what colonists called a bed warmer. No, this wasn't a kindly aunt, but a long-handled brass pan filled with hot embers, used to chase away the chill under the sheets. Carefully swirled through the bedding before one dared climb in, the bed warmer brought temporary relief, until such time as someone rolled over onto a 1-inch thick ice pocket that persisted regardless. Hot food, unsurprisingly, became its own form of central heating. Meals were slow-cooked, hearty, and designed to stick to your ribs in case your coat came unbuttoned, and winter took the opportunity to sneak in. Porridges, puddings, and stews bore names only a mother could love, like samb, a cornmeal mash reminiscent of warm wallpaper paste. But what it lacked in elegance, it made up for in warmth. And by the 4th day of leftovers, everyone stopped asking what it was. Drinks, too, were strategically imbibed. Warm ale, mulled cider, and hot chocolate. Not the kind swirled gently with cinnamon atop, but rather a colonial concoction made from grated cacao and sugar, boiled with water or milk in battered pots. No marshmallows, just a richness that lingered like a thermal blanket in your chest. But perhaps the cleverest winter survival tactic, aside from not going outside at all, was the art of early bedtime. Darkness came conveniently early, and with candle making an involved and smelly affair, few wasted daylight on idle wakefulness, so they climbed into bed hours before any modern human would even think about sheets, armed with heated stones wrapped in cloth and dreams of land ownership. And slowly, with whispers of wind along the rafters and the occasional loud snore from Uncle William, who had a sinus situation legendary even by colonial standards, the house would fall still. And somewhere, in that quiet, with the fire's last glow ebbing into a warm ember sigh, one could almost believe winter was just another slow dance with the dark. But as the snow deepened outside and the chickens clucked anxiously beneath their coats of frost, another sort of problem began to simmer quietly in the background. One involving smoke, flues, and the surprising hazards of chimneys. By the lantern glow of another frostbitten evening, the hearth crackled with the enthusiasm of a particularly extroverted log, casting flickers of amber light over the cabin walls. And while the flames danced, colonial families engaged in something more powerful than politics or powdered wigs. Survival via skillful gossip and the age-old art of textile wizardry, spinning, sewing, and mending. You see, winter had a cruel elegance in colonial America, a season so dramatic it deserved its own powdered wig. Snow might fall so deeply that roofs had to be shoveled from the inside. Roofs, particularly in New England, were cunningly designed with trapdoors. Why? So that if a blizzard turned your doorway into a nice fortress, you could pop out the top like a determined squirrel emerging from a snowdrift. Resourceful, certainly. Fashionable. Questionable. So while winds sharpened their icicles and tore through the woods with the subtlety of a town crier on market day, families turned indoors with layers of clothing and something remarkably comforting: chatter, needlework, and the humming rhythm of pre-industrial productivity. Wool, if you hadn't guessed yet, was the true monarch of the colonies, fluffy, warm, and just itchy enough to keep your circulation moving. When sheep were sheared back in the warmer months, women and even some reluctantly cooperative children would card the wool, spin it into yarn using spinning wheels or drop spindles, which are exactly as easy to use as they sound, which is not very, and get to knitting with all the speed and precision of a deeply caffeinated pioneer. Stockings were prized possessions, not merely leg decoration 101. They were life-saving garments. The more inventive souls would even knit patches atop patches, creating stocking-on-stocking turducken fashion statements. Holes were inevitable, but they had an elegant solution for that too: darning. Not so much an exciting word as it is a quiet rebellion against entropy. Men didn't necessarily get off easier. Those who weren't out gathering firewood or feeding the livestock found themselves drafted into tasks like mending tools, carving utensils, or badly contributing to knitting with all the enthusiasm of a cat tasked with embroidery. Household democracy was alive and well, and everyone knew that warm hands made lighter chores. In the longer evenings, people sewed by candlelight, one eye on the stitching, one eye on not setting the house on fire. Candles, after all, were precious. Made of beeswax or tallow, they were hoarded like edible light bulbs, and if you could get your hands on enough light to thread a needle, you were doing better than most. Candlelight sewing also cultivated a unique, squinty intimacy, the sharing of quiet jokes and whispered worries over thread and cloth. And while fashion may have been mostly utilitarian, that didn't stop a bit of flair from slipping in. Embroidery was a colonial pastime that served both as ornamentation and proof one had not gone entirely mad in the snow-locked depths of January. Some would stitch quotes, initials, or even surprisingly saucy aphorisms into handkerchiefs and household linens. Cold hands, warm heart, one might say. Or slightly less romantic, don't borrow my clothes again, Sarah. Quilting bees provided more than just extra blankets. They offered a way for neighbors to huddle together like powdered moths to a flame, sharing gossip, recipes, and the occasional scandalous tale of someone's goat getting into the preacher's garden again. The quilts themselves became silent storytellers. Hexagons, stars, wheels, and logs stitched in narrative quietude, symbols of skill, patience, and the knowledge that winter, too, would pass. Children, meanwhile, made dolls out of rags and corn husks, their woolen-clad fingers learning the nimbleness of earlier generations. Games were invented with buttons and string, and on some magical evenings, the elder might unwind a ghost story by the fire, one that may or may not have involved that time Uncle Josiah got snowed into the smokehouse and emerged 3 days later with a beard full of ham. All the while, clothing remained layered and cherished. Underthings, outer things, middle things, all working shoulder to shoulder against the chill. Capes and cloaks, bonnets and mittens, long woolen underwear with buttons that mocked you in the night when nature called. Each item was crafted with care and worn like a homespun badge of honor. And so, Among flickering candlelight and the soft hum of spinning wheels, the colonial family passed their winter nights, fortified by wool, warmed by storytelling, and bound together by the gentle rhythm of thread through cloth. As the flame in the hearth murmurs down to embers, we shall gently turn toward another treasured fireside tradition, not of stitching seams, but of steeping stews, where the true measure of community might just be found in a communal pot, underneath the stubborn chill of a colonial American winter, when the snow stacked itself like bakery loaves along the eaves and the wind composed sonatas in the chimney flue. There rested a surprisingly heartwarming truth. Survival wasn't just about chopping wood or salting pork. It was also about community, or as they would have called it, neighborliness, with a healthy dash of mutual nosiness. For the average colonist, the cruelest days of winter were not faced alone. Pure individualism might make for excellent modern television, but back then, it would more likely get you frostbite. The practice of being was common. And no, this didn't involve buzzing insects wearing little bonnets. These were work bees, gatherings where neighbors united to tackle tasks that required both brawn and moral support. Barn raisings, quilt stitchings, and log sawings would all happen during these cooperative events. But in the dead of winter, the most popular bee might have been the wood bee. That's when everyone descended on old Samuel's homestead to help him replenish his meager pile of firewood, while he, in turn, served hot cider and tales suspiciously embroidered with heroism. See, helping each other wasn't just charity, it was insulation with benefits. By the flicker of rushlights, candles made from soaked reeds or cotton twine dipped in animal fat, a line of camaraderie held fast against the winter gloom. Inside those one-room cottages, gathered beneath low ceilings thick with smoke-stained beams, neighbors might exchange recipes for hardtack that wouldn't chip molars. They'd swap yarns to be spun, literally and figuratively, and debate critical matters like whose hens were still laying, or which child had been caught sledding with the chamber pot lid again. You see, long winter nights had an odd way of turning daily tedium into treasured tradition. It was during these fireside visits that community knowledge wiggled its way along the timeline, inching from one generation to the next, like a particularly determined woolly worm. One might learn that boiling spruce needles made a passable tea rich in vitamin C, or that if you tried to smoke out weevils from your flour by setting it near the fire, you'd likely just end up with a very flowery fire. Stories, true, embellished, or outrageously false, were embroidered together while socks were darned and mittens reknitted. There were no bedtime podcasts to listen to, of course, but Aunt Mercy's terrifying tale of the ghost lumberjack with an axe for a leg did the trick just fine. One delightful quirk of colonial winter evenings was the custom of the bundling board. This was a wooden plank cleverly positioned in the featherbed to separate courting couples, because while winter might be long and dark, temptation was apparently longer and darker. The board was supposed to allow young lovers to share warmth without sharing, shall we say, anything else. According to parental belief, nothing induced chastity quite like an improvised headboard between your knees. But back to the neighbors. If a family ran low on wax or tallow, someone else usually had some to spare. If little Betty from up the hill took ill, hands around the village might appear at the doorstep with elderberry syrup, wool blankets, and unsolicited advice. The elderberry syrup was usually more useful than the advice. Usually. Even distaste had its seasonal truce. Families who bickered over fence lines or the scandalous overuse of the village well might nevertheless share firewood or a slab of salt pork when it came down to it. Cold, it seems, has a way of melting grudges. In that chill-touched hush between fire crackles and frost-laced windows, the winter had its own rhythm, a quiet symphony of breath and kettle whistles, of socks warming on hearthstones and voices murmuring under layered quilts. Sleep came earlier then, not because people were tired, but because the night had more time in it, and more stars to keep watch. Thus, when the snow whispered at the doorframe and the wolves howled at a distance that felt both near and mythic, the colonists curled closer to the flames and each other. Survival, in the end, wasn't just about layering wool or drying beans. It was about knowing Mrs. Cleary would lend you her kettle if yours cracked from the cold, and she'd probably throw in a wedge of sour apple pie and a warning not to sit too close to the fire unless you fancied roasting your breeches, as the smoke curled lazily up from stone chimneys into the endless winter sky. Another quiet evening slipped into history, and the long, slow dream of survival carried on. And now, with that warmth of neighborly whispers still echoing through the rafters, the fire glows lower, inviting us to settle further into what came next in the flickering heart of winter's hold. As the first brittle snap of ice glazed over the surface of the water barrel, colonial families knew the cold had committed. No turning back now. Winter was in full congress with their daily lives, elbowing its way into every crevice of the cabin. By now, families had seemingly made an unspoken truce with the routine inconveniences of winter. The outhouse, for example, had become less a necessity and more a frosted dare. Most folks devised clever solutions to dodge the sobering sprint through snowdrifts under starlight, like chamber pots, which were unceremoniously tucked under beds, tragically revealing the uncomfortable truths of 18th century plumbing. Emptying them was yet another chilly saga, but one better sung softly than shouted. Inside the home, winter meant everything slowed down. Chores became rituals, fewer and more focused, like carefully chosen words in a long lullaby. Women busied themselves with spinning wool into thread, repairing garments, or, when feeling especially luxurious, embroidering handkerchiefs with designs that range from ornate florals to something vaguely resembling a cat mid-sneeze. Quilting bees became social events, thinner on gossip during the cold months, but thicker on warm cider and mutual sighs. Children, half free from school, which was often conducted by an underpaid neighbor in a very chilly kitchen, were employed as tiny assistants. They schlepped firewood with dramatic gusto, fed the animals with mittens only slightly less hole-ridden than the feeding baskets, and were sometimes tasked with gingerly rotating apples strung over the hearth so they didn't scorch on one side. It was a full-time job, being quaint. Fireplaces, once merely dramatic furniture pieces, now became the very heart of the home, both literally and figuratively. All heat radiated from this central altar of flickering warmth. Cooking, drying socks, storytelling. It all happened right there. Hearths were where bread was baked in cast iron limbs of mysteriously shaped Dutch ovens, where salt pork hissed in the skillet like it had secrets to tell, and where multiple generations attempted to toast their backsides simultaneously. It could be said that some families spent more collective hours facing away from each other around the hearth than anywhere else. To keep the cold at bay, windows were quilted over with fabric, cheesecloth, burlap, or something not properly identifiable but thick enough to shame a breeze. In more luxurious households, those wreathed in actual glass panes, greased paper acted as insulation, catching the sunlight and diffusing it into what might barely be called ambience. But let's not get too grand. Winter light through greased paper has all the charm of warm mayonnaise, usable but not poetic. And then there were the draft stoppers, long sausages of cloth, often looking like limp-stuffed snakes, nestled at the base of doors and windows, hopeless warriors against the bitter bite of the wind. Some families named theirs. Some of those names were regrettably poetic, but anything for a laugh in the frostbitten dead of February. Meals were predictable but dependable. Root vegetables, turnips, onions, potatoes offered their stoic companionship. Salted meats stepped in as protein-rich relics from warmer months. On good days, there might be hoe cakes or johnny cakes crisped gently on a griddle, drenched in molasses so thick you needed a spoon and a small pep talk. Porridge became its own food group, ever present and ever divisible, thinned by whatever liquid lay closest. Milk if you were lucky, water if not, ale if Uncle Silas already dipped into the dairy stores. And in the evenings, when the wind howled like a distant aunt whose opinions were uninvited but persistent, the family would settle close. They shared stories from distant places, sometimes about grand voyages across the ocean, sometimes about that one cow that fell through the ice, but survived somehow, because colonial cows had either immense resolve or secret fins. These hours, lit by flickering tallow candles and the orange breath of the hearth, were the truest resistance to the cold. They were acts of warmth by virtue of proximity, shared laughter, and the way grandmother could tell the same spooky story a dozen times and still create a shiver unrelated to the cold. Some moments in winter weren't about endurance. They were about stillness. Watching snow fall through the chinks of the shutter, feeling the fire's heat seeping into limbs like a soft spell, hearing the soft scuff of a mouse in the rafters and deciding peacefully that it was probably old enough to pay rent. And tomorrow would come, wrapped in grey light and the scent of ash and apples. But tonight drifted on, calm and quiet, carried along by the creak of the wooden beams and the slow, steady hum of survival under snow. And in that stillness, we'll settle into the next layer of warmth and wonder, tucked deeper into the snowy folds of winter's long, slumberous tail. As winter deepened its grip on colonial America, an unspoken hierarchy formed. Not among the people, mind, you, but among blankets. Yes, blankets. In the 18th century family home, nothing settled a disagreement faster than a homespun woolen quilt thick enough to smother a bear. Simply put, the person with the heaviest blanket was no longer interested in arguing about firewood collection or whose turn it was to churn the butter. They had won. With daylight hours trimmed down to delicate slivers between dusky dawn and early twilight, the colonists became more in tune with their hearth than their horologes. Time was measured in tea steeps and stew bubbles. The center of every home, regardless of how grand or humble, was the fireplace. These roaring stone mouths did more than heat. They cooked, dried, gathered, and sometimes doubled as an accidental place to nap, if one was small enough and supervised by a cat. Ah yes, cats. Winter's unsung companions. While their summer habits involved dashing under bushes and avoiding human interaction with Olympic flair, in winter they metamorphosed into highly priced lap accessories. Colonial cats earned their kibbles by keeping food stores free from mice and offering the added bonus of warm, vibrating footrests. Some families became so fond of their feline foot warmers that they stitched extra patches onto their blankets to catch stray whiskers and purring dreams. Now, not everything in a colonial winter could be solved with purring or porridge. Much depended on one's ability to accept compromise with the elements. Windows, for example, had an uneasy relationship with insulation. Glass was expensive, rare, often hoarded by the wealthy like precious gems. Most homes instead relied on oiled animal skins, paper greased with lard, or simple wooden shutters braced tight against winter's breath. Through these modest coverings, the outside world looked permanently smudged, like a dream half remembered after waking. And then there were bed warmers. Oh, delightful, slightly terrifying bed warmers. Metal pans with long handles, filled with scorching embers from the hearth and slipped between the linen sheets before bedtime. If you've never experienced the adrenaline of holding a miniature fire in thin brass while praying your mattress doesn't ignite, have you truly lived through a colonial winter? These fiery saucers were passed with reverent caution from one family member to another, often accompanied by warnings like, "Don't burn the ticking," or "Remember what happened to Uncle Silas." Speaking of ingenuity, little was wasted during these months. The drippings from cooking meats, for example, didn't merely flavor beans. They were stored and reused for everything from soap making to greasing squeaky door hinges. Colonial houses in winter smelled like an odd fusion of broth, boots, and beeswax, a scent that, if bottled today, might be called ye olde eau d'endurance. Water, one of life's simpler blessings during warmer months, turned traitorous in the cold. Buckets froze, wells iced, over, and pipes, which then were made of wood, metal being reserved for more noble pursuits like sword hilts and chamber pots, often cracked or required mending with leather straps and prayer. Some families took to melting snow upon the hearth, turning tiny flurries into steaming cups of utility. Indoor snow-melting bowls were kept ready near the fire, positioned with the careful anticipation of a 3-inch snowfall or the whims of a roof that forgot its purpose. Mealtimes grew longer, not just out of necessity but for cheer and warmth. Hot cider and hearty stews became the rhythm of existence. Bread baked over ash and hung to dry like laundry was often less a bite and more an activity, chewing thick slices with determination, as if digesting slowly might prolong the mealtime gathering. Storytelling flourished in those months too, with little light and even less urgency to hurry. Evenings unfurled into fireside epics. Elders recounted tales of wolves tamed with fiddle music or snows so deep they swallowed chimneys. Tales met with skeptical eyebrows and enthusiastic nods from children snug beneath those aforementioned victorious blankets. There was a kind of hush over everything. Snow muffled the sound of life, and the cold slowed its pace. Even the chickens appeared contemplative. Winter was not merely survived, it was shared, with layers, laughter, small fires, and an alarming number of turnips. And as stars crept across the ice-glazed sky once more, families finished their chores and crept back beneath quilts filled with feathers, cat fur, and community. Silence deepened. Soot drifted down like one last sleepy snow, and somewhere in the distance, a shutter creaked in gentle protest against the wind. But just as coziness settled in, something stirred beyond the hearth, a clue to how neighbors helped one another make it through the hardest weeks, when even the fire seemed to yawn. By the time late January rolled in, the colonial hearth had turned into the stage upon which grand culinary theatre played out nightly, or more accurately, upon which slightly re-warmed leftover mush was ladled into wooden bowls before everyone gratefully collapsed face first into it. Now that most of the fresh produce had long since been either preserved, salted, pickled, or simply resigned to the frost, folks got creative with what was left. Creative in the kale 300 ways sort of way. The winter kitchen of an ordinary colonial home was less of a pantry paradise and more of a stubborn display of culinary duct tape. Root vegetables became stars of the winter table, though they never expected or asked for the spotlight. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, tough tubers with names that sound like they go to the same boarding school, were dug up from their earthen cellars, still wearing dirt like little frosty coats. If a family was lucky, they had a well-lined root cellar, which, despite sounding quaint, was really just a fancy term for a pit with shelves and hope. Meat, if it hadn't yet been devoured by December celebrations or hard-working January stomachs, was boiled again and again into broth that could keep the household alive, nourished, and steadily less enthused until spring. And then there was hasty pudding, a slightly misleading name, as there was absolutely nothing hasty about it. A sort of dense porridge made from cornmeal and water, sometimes molasses, if the week had been generous. It was less of a pudding and more of a spoon-defying brick, but it was warm, and it didn't talk back. Eating in the colonial winter often involved a certain kind of modest bravery. There were only so many ways to spice a slab of salted pork, when your spice rack consisted of precisely 2 items: dried sage and the sheer strength of your imagination. But meals were not just about warmth and survival. Mealtime was one of the few moments in the winter day when everyone gathered close, not just because it was customary, but because it was the only room where fingers could thaw. Children huddled near the fire, eyes half-lidded, listening to the grown-ups recount stories of winters more terrible than this one, which was apparently a sort of competitive colonial pastime. Oh, you think this is cold? Why, back in '72 we had to chisel our way out of the house using a frozen chicken leg. Cooking tools themselves added their own rustic charm. Cast iron pots so heavy they could double as security devices, occasionally swinging dangerously when bumped. Wooden spoons gone smooth from generations of stirring, poking, and the occasional dramatic pointing. But what really gave that winter kitchen its soul were the little rituals: a sprinkle of flour on the hearthstone before baking the daily loaf, a whispered thank you to whatever spirit lived in the oven flue, and the hopeful glance into the drying rack, just in case today was the magical day when cheese happened. Yes, cheese. Sometimes, if the household had a cow or two who were miraculously still producing milk in the cold, there'd be a lovely winter activity known as cheese attempt. Making cheese in the winter was a delicate balance of temperature, time, and blind optimism. More often than not, the result was either something edible or something a little suspicious, which the family politely pushed around on their plates and eventually offered to the chickens. Baking bread was perhaps the great performance of the winter kitchen. Dough was kept warm near the fire, a little creature nestled in a wool blanket of hope. If it rose, the entire household rejoiced. If it didn't, you could bet someone would still eat it. Waste not, want not, as the colonial motto goes, along with, it's fine if you toast it enough. Add to that a mug of small beer, basically mildly alcoholic grain water with the personality of a soggy cracker, and you had the classic colonial winter supper. Nutritional, yes. Exciting, not particularly. But it filled the belly, and sometimes that was enough to count a day as successful. Beneath the candle-lit haze and the familiar scent of drying herbs hung from the rafters, these humble kitchens did more than feed stomachs. They warmed souls, mended moods, and gave structure to long, cold evenings. Outside, the snow still whispered against the shutters, but within the hearth-lit walls, where root vegetables reigned and hope smelled faintly of parsnip, another simple supper wound to a close, and with bowls scraped clean and stories half finished, the fire now crackled a bit lower. Just enough warmth to linger as new footsteps padded toward the attic ladder, where drafts danced with flickering shadows and colonial bedtime began its own curious routine. As the heavy snows lay thick across the fields like a woolen blanket stitched by a distracted sheep, the colonists of New England faced a long and frosted dilemma: how to stay warm without turning into human icicles or burning the roof beams in desperation. This, naturally, led to one of the most beloved inventions of colonial ingenuity, the fireplace. And not just your average flickering fireplace, mind you, but a cavernous hearth so large that some families joked, awkwardly but earnestly, that you could roast a whole moose in it. If you could catch one, of course. Central heating, of course, had not yet been invented, and the only thermostat on hand was Grandma Mildred, who declared it too cold or too warm, depending solely on how her knitting was going. No one dared argue with her, especially after she beaned Uncle Josiah with a spoon for hogging the hearth. Colonial homes were designed with hearths as their beating heart, made from hulking stone and brick, fuel-hungry monsters that demanded a steady diet of logs. Chopping wood was not so much a task as it was a way of life. The family axe was as revered as the family Bible. Both were crucial for survival, though only one occasionally gave blisters. Children learned the fine art of stacking firewood in precise geometrical patterns, which they fondly nicknamed log puzzles for staying alive. Outdoors, snow could pile 3 feet high, but inside, if the fireplace was burning strong, you might feel something approaching actual warmth if you were sitting about 3 inches from the hearth and weren't too picky. But for those unlucky enough to be parked on the far end of the room, for instance, near an exterior wall, the experience was akin to winter camping in an under-insulated barn. This led to cozy innovations like bed warmers, essentially long-handled pans filled with hot coals that were slipped under the covers before bedtime. And yes, they were just as risky as they sound. Falling asleep next to a pan of miniature fire was considered perfectly reasonable behavior, though you had to be very careful not to singe your nightcap or your eyebrows. Speaking of sleep, let us not forget the humble warming stone, which was heated near the fire and then wrapped in flannel or wool before being tucked at the foot of the bed. Some people even gave their stones names, and considering how much they relied upon them to keep their toes from turning into frozen nubbins, we can't really blame them. Old Bernie and Sizzlin' Sue were reportedly among the more popular monikers. And then there was the ultimate winter luxury, a feather bed, stuffed with down plucked lovingly, or perhaps with mild aggression. From geese, a feather bed mattress could make the otherwise back-breaking wooden frame feel like a cloud quilted by angels with orthopedic degrees. Paired with a dozen or more hand-stitched quilts, some colonists claimed it was like sleeping in a pastry, if pastries were occasionally damp from frost and tended to smell of soot. Indoor layering was the unspoken rule of the season. Colonists slept in their long johns, usually with a knit cap and sometimes mittens, creating a look that can only be described as elegant scarecrow meets domestic ninja. Staying warm was not about elegance. It was about surviving frostbite inside your own home. And let us not forget the time-honored fashion accessory of winter insomnia, the ice-covered chamber pot lid. Life during cold colonial winters was indeed rugged, but it had a kind of rhythmic charm. Simpler routines and trusted remedies. Most households followed a strict sun schedule, not because of virtuous discipline, but because candles were precious and night fell fast. Once the fire was banked and the last ember covered with ashes to keep it smouldering till morning, the family curled into bed, a mass of sleepy siblings and snoring elders, warmed by shared body heat and a shared sense of, well, we didn't freeze today. Outside, the wind howled around the edges of wooden shingles, testing each knot and crack in the clapboard walls. Inside, poppets and pegs held drying mittens, and the soft crackle of a dying fire provided the colonists' most beloved winter lullaby. Just beyond the fire's glow, the scent of salted pork hung in the air, hinting at tomorrow's modest, if oily, breakfast. But before sunrise stirred the house back into motion, there remained these last sacred hours of warmth, quiet, and something like peace. Which brings us to the unassuming but vital hero of every cold colonial night, the humble quilt, and just how many layers of patchwork it really took to fend off a New Hampshire January. Well, drift a little deeper with me as the snow taps gently against the panes. Of all the many challenges brought by a colonial winter, the biting cold, the dwindling food, the suspiciously creaky noises in the attic, probably just wind, hopefully not raccoons. Few were as consistently dreaded as laundry day. Now, to be clear, laundry in the 1700s wasn't something you penciled into a convenient weekend slot. It was a monumental endeavor, more akin to full-scale battle, but with more lye, soap, and fewer drums. And when snow blanketed the ground and water froze in buckets overnight, things got particularly interesting. For starters, water was a bit of a diva in winter. You couldn't just turn on a tap. Those wouldn't appear for quite some time, and instead had to haul the stuff from a creek or well, which sounds fine until your local creek turns into a solid ice sculpture. Breaking through that ice became a regular part of the chore, often with an axe, some grumbling, and a quick prayer that you wouldn't slip in wearing nothing but woolen socks and a determined expression. Once water was wrangled and hauled, sometimes needing multiple trips if more than one child had conducted ill-advised mud angels the week prior, the real artistry began. A tub or barrel was filled near the hearth, where a fire crackled valiantly against the cold, and the water was warmed with irons glowing from the flames. Soap was, well, let's just say it was homemade and mostly effective. Rendered from leftover animal fat and lye leached from wood ashes, it had the consistency of semi-regret and smelled like if bacon and despair had a baby. Still, it cleaned things, and that was what mattered. Clothes were beaten with paddles, scrubbed against washboards, and twisted with elbows and knees until most of the dirt recoiled in shame and left. The garments were then rinsed several times in cold water, and yes, even when it was snowing, offering the laundress an unexpected upper body workout and a one-way ticket to very cold hands. Drying clothes posed its own challenges. There were no fluffy tumble dryers. Instead, garments were hung along fireplace mantles and wooden rods suspended from the rafters, a sort of rustic, fabric-based interior design choice. In desperate moments, pantaloons were even draped over chairs, and shirts arranged on backs of sleeping dogs who'd wandered too close to the fire and found themselves conscripted into service. Outside drying was reserved for the brave or the slightly delusional. Shirts and undergarments would freeze into comically stiff shapes, forming a parade of torso ghosts across the yard if left too long. Folding frozen linen required either time, patience, or giving up entirely, and accepting new decorative wall hangings. Now, let's not forget, laundry wasn't done weekly. Oh, heavens no. It was often put off as long as possible. Under normal circumstances, small stains were removed as needed with snow scrubs, which were exactly what they sound like. A handful of snow, a quick scrub, and a pang of hope that the fabric wouldn't be too offended. And since people wore layers, many layers, clothing was rotated, aired out, and reworn as long as humanly tolerable. Let's say, if a chemise didn't walk away on its own, it lived to see another day. Linen shifts were cherished like old friends and washed only when absolutely necessary, partly to preserve the cloth and partly to avoid the full-day pageant that was a washing session. Children, unsurprisingly, found endless amusement in laundry day. From splashing in soapy water to poking freshly dried trousers until they collapsed into soft heaps. It was one of the few times the tedium of winter broke into spontaneous hilarity. Of course, their enthusiasm often ended the moment they were asked to help with rinsing. Despite the drudgery, laundry day had its moments of charm. The warm scent of damp wool by the fire, the rhythmic slap of cloth against washboard, the way steam curled upward like tiny winter ghosts trying to climb the chimney. It was domestic poetry in motion, heated, soapy, fragrant poetry. And when the day was done and the laundry hung neatly like banners of survival, families would gather near the warmth, sipping thin chowder or nibbling the last of the preserved apples while the clean clothes dried gently above. It was, in its own modest way, a triumph. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, of course. Perhaps the bread starter would freeze solid again, or someone's mittens would mysteriously vanish in the snow. But for now, with chores mostly done, and woolen socks steamed and smiling on the hearth, it was time to sit back, exhale, and listen for the next crackle of the fire. And speaking of fires, the colonial hearth wasn't just for warmth. It also happened to be the place where many winter meals took shape or charred slightly around the edges. By the time snow had iced every roof beam and tree branch, most colonial folks in New England had accepted that their world had shrunk dramatically. The winter months turned even the bravest pioneer into an accidental homebody. All plans postponed by snowdrifts and sleet, all adventures cancelled by a lack of sunlight and toes. So what exactly did people do when they weren't trudging through snow or desperately trying to reattach their mittens to their cold, regretting having fingers' hands? They sat, a lot, but not just sitting. No, they practiced the ancient colonial art of not going entirely mad when snowed in with your relatives for 5 months. It involved an impressive rotation of low-energy tasks, spinning wool, mending socks, and recounting the same 5 stories until everyone in the household could lip-sync them backwards. Inside a typical log cabin, let's imagine we're there now, it's dim, a little smoky, and smells faintly of soup, sweat, and last autumn's apples. The hearth blinks with orange firelight as a colonial mother works the spinning wheel, her foot moving rhythmically on the treadle like a sleepy pigeon. She murmurs lullabies to herself, or possibly complaints. Hard to say. Meanwhile, the children entertain themselves with sticks, cats, or the occasional beetle. Toys, of course, weren't just scarce. They were, in many cases, considered too indulgent. Sometimes a corncob with a bit of rag tied around it passed for a doll. Gamblers might call that low stakes, but to a colonial child, it was the height of luxury. Toddlers developed surprisingly elaborate relationships with sticks. Some were even named. Evenings came early and lasted forever. With barely 9 hours of daylight and no screens to scroll through in bed, colonial folks got very, very efficient about dreaming. Historians believe people didn't sleep once per night but twice. A first sleep, followed by an hour or two of dreamy contemplation, chatty reflection, or perhaps sneaking to the hearth for a bit of stew, and then a second sleep. This middle-of-the-night pause had some rather poetic names: the watching hour, the quiet wake, or as Benjamin Franklin once implied with a wink, the hour when the house creaks like an old man, considering whether to get up or just forget it. You might think they were bored out of their frostbitten minds, and occasionally, when the mice had eaten the cheese, the Bible readings had gone a bit too fire and brimstone, and there were still 6 weeks until anything even remotely festive happened. They were. But boredom wasn't seen as a crisis. It was just something that happened, like Tuesday. To pass the time, songs were sung, many passed down like treasured quilts, and others made up on the spot. If you think freestyle rapping began in Brooklyn, you should have heard a colonial father rhyming about the stubbornness of a frozen privy door. It wasn't award-winning, but it was sincere. For those lucky enough to have a neighbor within shouting distance, there was the occasional winter visit, which began as surprise company and ended 2 nights later as something between a hostage situation and a crusty New Year's resolution. Once someone was over, sending them back into the howling weather required either a serious offense or the rising scent of cabin fever. And if you're wondering, yes, people played games too. Simple card games, counting games, even shadow puppets. A flickering hearth could turn anyone into a temporary thespian, especially if their spouse laughed at their chicken impression. There was even storytelling, not just about ghosts and goblins, though the colonial idea of a relaxing yarn often included at least one haunted well and a mysteriously vanishing goat. But stories served a dual purpose, scaring the children into staying in bed and reminding everyone that the past, even when dreadful, was at least warmer. Through it all, the fire had to be kept alive, always. Letting it go out was not merely inconvenient, it was cause for full-scale despair, or at least 20 solid minutes of poking embers with increasing urgency. And fetching new fire from a neighbor, if the worst occurred, was a chilly walk of shame through the snow, holding a covered ember in a pan and fending off judgment from passing squirrels. Outside, the snow stacked higher. Inside, the world moved softly, quietly, as if wrapped in wool. No one expected excitement. They expected survival and a little sweetness. Sometimes, if the molasses hadn't frozen, there was gingerbread. Not soft, chewy gingerbread like we know now. No, colonial gingerbread had the texture of a roof shingle and roughly the same shelf life, but it was warm, and it was theirs. And so, the cold months meandered on, slow and dark like soup left gently simmering. With frost on the windows and stories in the air, winter was, as strange as it sounds, a kind of rest. But don't get too cozy yet. For as the days lengthened ever so slightly and the roof began to drip just a touch, there were greater dramas waiting near the edge of spring. As the frost thickened and the nights grew longer, colonial homes across New England transformed into what might generously be called one-room survival pods. Not nearly as glamorous as that sounds, of course, unless your idea of glamour includes chamber pots, grease lamps, and the warm, ever-present scent of salted pork. In those endless nights of early January, when the wind howled like an unpaid tavern poet, colonial families gathered close around their hearths because they had no other choice. These weren't fireplaces for ambience, mind you. They were the very engines of life, capable of roasting meat, boiling laundry water, melting snow for drinking, and even, in a pinch, drying out your only pair of socks after they fell into your neighbor's cow trough again. Now, let us take a moment to appreciate George, a modest cooper, that's a barrel maker, living in rural Massachusetts. George was a man of few words, even fewer teeth, and exactly one woolen shirt, which he wore from mid-November until the first respectable crocus dared to bloom in April. His children, like many others, slept three to a bed, arranged like spoons, or perhaps more accurately, like complaints. It was crowded, itchy from woolen blankets, and the youngest had a nasal whistle that could soar through the peace of night like a dull blade through maple sap. Still, there was a rhythm. As with many colonial households, George's family rotated their mattress, not for comfort, but to let the less popular side thaw out. The bed itself was stuffed with corn husks and the spirit of practicality. Feathers were a luxury, and springs hadn't yet been invented, unless you count the kind found in nature, which colonial mattresses most assuredly did not. To warm the sheets, some folks used bed warmers, metal pans filled with hot coals and swished beneath the covers like a clumsy ghost hunting for comfort. Others preferred the soapstone method, which involved heating a smooth block of soapstone all day in the fire and then tucking it between your frozen toes at night. Of course, this also required something colonial winters were not known for: no one kicking over the soapstone while sleepwalking to relieve themselves in a wooden pot. Speaking of which, the chilly business of nighttime relief was a complex one. Chamber pots were the norm, but emptying them was a dreadful morning task, generally blamed on the youngest child, or, failing that, the second youngest, with much arguing and maternal sighing. Some daring souls risked the outhouse trip, crunching through snow in their nightshirts and muttering prayers to whatever saints might govern bladders and frostbite. Food, naturally, was as tightly rationed as warmth. The January table often featured meals cooked in enormous pots that were rarely fully washed, seasoned over the months like a leathery old soup diary. A stew could begin its life with rabbit and end with parsnips, journeying through bits of hominy, onions from the root cellar, and the occasional hint of something mysterious and chewy. Flavor, at this point in winter, was less a pursuit and more a memory. Yet, in all this chill and scarcity, there was something oddly heartening. On long winter evenings, storytelling flourished, not only around hearths but under quilts, behind drawn curtains, and often illuminated by a single flickering tallow candle that smelled faintly of wet sheep. Parents told exaggerated tales of their own winters growing up. Your grandmother once lost 3 toes and still walked uphill to church, both ways. Children traded gossip that they barely understood. Martha's dad has the pox. And grandparents simply hummed, having heard it all before. Even music found its way into this frozen season, with no fiddle in the house because someone traded it for a bushel of apples back in October. The children drummed out rhythms with spoons, while the family sang hymns in reverent tones that sometimes slipped into laughter when someone's voice cracked or the baby tooted in perfect harmony. Each breath formed a ghost in the cold room, curling into the shadows before fading near the ceiling beams. And in all of this, the clanging of cast iron, the muffled thump of boots drying by the hearth, the scratch of wool against skin, life carried on. The stillness of the colonial winter night was not quiet, you see, but filled with the small murmurs of survival, a sigh before sleep, the crackle of embers, the rustle of heavy quilts shifting as someone dreamt of spring or pie, or just a mattress that didn't poke you in the hip. And somewhere, far off through the trees, a distant owl called out, reminding George and us that not all creatures hibernate during these frosty months, but that, as always, is another cozy surprise waiting just around the snowy bend. As winter deepened and the days took on that silvery hush of snow-muffled quiet, colonial families turned inward, both literally and metaphorically. By January, most homes weren't just sheltering from the cold. They were also enduring the slow, smoky sameness of unending winter routines and the unmistakable aroma of dried fish and boiled cabbage. Ah yes, the true perfume of perseverance. Life inside a colonial home in deepest winter was a strange blend of boredom, pragmatic industry, and fireside strategy. Think less prancing by the hearth, and more, don't move too fast or you'll break the ice in your beard. The fireplace remained the command center of survival, not just the glowing heart of warmth and food, but the neighborhood TikTok, newsstand, and indoor weather channel. Watch the smoke to learn the forecast. If the smoke curled downwards and hung low in the room, it meant a pressure drop, or possibly just a faulty chimney. Either way, the conversation would perk up briefly before returning to its regular schedule of silence and stitchwork. Women's handiwork took center stage this time of year. Knitting, darning, spinning. Activities so essential, they became almost meditative. Fingers flew over needles with the efficiency of tiny, wool-wielding dancers. Warmth, after all, wasn't just a luxury. It was a matter of stitching one's way out of hypothermia. Every extra scarf or pair of mittens was an act of love, of resistance, and sometimes, just sometimes, passive-aggressively gifted to a relative who dared to complain about the cold. And though the colonists were practical folk, they weren't entirely immune to the spectre of cabin fever. Imagine a family of 7 crammed in one candle-lit room, all slowly simmering beside the stew pot, like extra ingredients bumping elbows. Privacy was about as common as tropical fruit. To get through the endless sameness of snow-covered Mondays and Tuesdays and Blursdays, colonists turned to stories, spoken aloud like soft embers crackling in the cold. Children would gather near the fire, eyes wide, as their elders spun yarns of local legends, old country ghosts, or a time, long, long ago, when you could actually go outside without losing feeling in your toes. These stories weren't written in books so much as etched into the folds of memory, passed down like invisible heirlooms that kept everyone a little warmer. For entertainment with a pinch of risk, families also played riddles by firelight. Nothing high stakes, unless you consider the loser having to fetch more firewood from the snow-drowned woodshed. Spoiler: no one liked losing. Even letters from loved ones gained an almost sacred reverence during these months. Well, when they could be delivered, of course. If the weather allowed, a battered parcel might arrive, wrapped in burlap and prayers, and torn into like a long-lost treasure chest. Dry goods, perhaps, or an extra length of cloth, and best of all, an update on Cousin Prudence's latest scandal, which gave everyone something new to whisper about while pretending not to listen. As for nutrition, well, meal planning in January looked more like, what can we boil today that won't kill us? Root vegetables, precious dried apples, coarse grains from the previous fall's harvest, all simmered into what might charitably be called stew, and less charitably be called, why is it grey? Meat, when available, was carefully rationed, not just because of scarcity, but because it had to last until spring thaw. Anything salted or smoked had the distinct personality of having once sat next to actual flavour. Yet, no one complained aloud. At least not within earshot of Ma. She wielded the cooking ladle like a musket, quiet but not to be trifled with, Remarkably, even amid the hardship, colonists found small, strange delights. Icicles were broken off roof edges like crunchy candies. Snow was scooped for chilled cream sweetened with molasses. Primitive yet delightful, the colonial version of dessert. And sometimes, on still winter nights, one might step out on a creaky porch, listen to the deep hush of snow falling on snow, and feel, just briefly, the mystery of endurance. A tiny flicker of beauty in the frostbitten stillness. And so, the homes hummed on, alive with the quiet beat of survival, the tick of the spinning wheel, and the rhythmic drip of a ceiling leak. Soon, we'll step beyond the hearth and into the barn, where winter tested not only the people, but the animals they depended on with every last stubborn straw. Among the quietest but most essential lifesavers during a colonial winter was not a hero with an axe or a genial blacksmith with a stash of pickled ham. No, the true unsung hero, the cellar. Not the spooky, cobweb-laced horror movie kind of cellar that makes you question your bravery, or remember that one candle you definitely left burning upstairs. We're talking about the earthen-walled, cool but not too cold, stone-lined food vaults nestled beneath the homes of many colonial families. Those gloriously humble root cellars that preserved not only vegetables, but indeed the family's very survival. You see, before refrigerators beeped and buzzed at us in the night, and before freezers churned ice more loudly than a colonial cow giving birth, surprisingly common in frost snaps, winter storage relied on a very balanced combination of dirt, discipline, and divine luck. Root cellars worked on the principle that Mother Earth herself would keep things temperate, not freezing, not melting. Just that fascinating middle ground that carrots, turnips, apples, and a humble spud or two would consider heavenly. If done properly, a single cellar could cradle enough food to sustain a family till the robins started gossiping about spring again. Now, here's where it gets charmingly human. The ideal winter pantry was, shall we say, moody. Potatoes, for example, didn't want the dark just because they wanted it because light made them sprout. Sprouting was a waste of energy, and nobody wanted their dinner growing legs and making a run for it. Meanwhile, cabbages wanted space. Stack them too tight, and suddenly you're not eating cabbage. You're fermenting it against your will. Apples. Well, some types got along, some didn't. Put a sour tender pippin next to a heavy-spirited russet, and the smell alone could start what historians now gently refer to as micro-conflicts of the produce shelf. Then there were the meats. Smoked hams and salted pork rarely took up residence in the cellar proper. These delicacies relied on another crucial winter structure, the smokehouse. Unlike the root cellar, which snuggled into the ground like a sleepy badger, the smokehouse stood upright and serious, constructed sturdily from logs or bricks, endlessly perfumed with the deep, hopeful scent of hickory and applewood. Families didn't just salt their meat, they revered it, sometimes giving their oldest ham a name and a reputation, not unlike a feisty uncle. It was not uncommon for visiting neighbors to be introduced to a family's hanging prosciutto with a nod of respect and a whispered, "That one's from '74, the long snow year." But even with smoked meats and shadowy root vegetables, storage was a constant game of patience. Colonial households owned few luxuries, but one thing they had an abundance of was tradition. And nothing says tradition quite like using a hollowed-out gourd as a ladle, because your actual ladle fell into the fire after someone mistook it for the kindling pile. Winter preservation required tasks done methodically. Crocks of pickled onions were rotated weekly, cheeses brushed to manage the mold. dried herbs strung like garlands across kitchen beams, so that even mid-January had a faint whiff of summer. No one wasted food unless it was truly unsalvageable. And even then, some households swore that slightly off sauerkraut tasted more complex, though modern science would classify that boldness under high-risk snacking. Of course, families didn't solely rely on their own stores. Trading and neighborly bartering were love languages in long winters. Your family had too many turnips. Trade for a jar of someone's gooseberry preserves, or a prized cut of bacon that may or may not be older than your youngest child. Knowledge, too, was exchanged, possibly the most valuable commodity of all. Which crops stored best in sawdust? Whose barn cat was least likely to eat the flour sacks? Who had an aunt who claimed that burying carrots upright kept them sweeter? These conversations lit up fireside hearts more reliably than oak logs, because in truth, survival wasn't about stockpiling. It was about community. Colonial winters, for all their bitterness, had a unique way of drawing people closer, elbow to elbow in shared cellars or huddled around shared pots of stew. And just as the root cellar watched over the spoils of fall, another quiet ritual of winter was taking shape just a few creaky wooden steps above. By the time February tiptoed across the frost-hardened soil of colonial New England, most families had made peace, of a sort, with the peculiar rhythm of winter. The early desperation of November was long behind them, as was the romantic optimism of feasting around Christmas, or whatever version of it your particular denomination permitted. Now was the stretch of winter where your boots were permanently damp, your fingers permanently chapped, and your conversations with neighboring households took on the dreamy quality of people waiting together in a very cold, very long queue for spring. Inside the houses, the real battleground was monotony, and cold drafts, of course, and something scratching in the rafters, but mostly monotony. Households developed quiet rituals to tame the ticking hours. In the evenings, by the fire that sputtered like it too, had grown tired of winter, families turned to the great colonial pastime, storytelling. Not the type with dragons or dashing romance, though every now and then a particularly spry granny might throw in a suspiciously heroic tale about her friend who once outwitted a British tax officer with nothing but a spindle and quick thinking. No, most tales were about relatives, farmers, or woodland misadventures involving raccoons and misplaced shoes. In some homes, especially among the more literate settlers, former school teachers, wayward ministers, and the odd family who'd smuggled in a trunk load of books, winter reading circles became unexpectedly enthusiastic affairs. Picture 3 generations huddled under itchy wool blankets, taking turns solemnly reading aloud from Pilgrim's Progress, while the baby tried to eat the corner of the family Bible, and the dog pretended he hadn't just tracked in something suspiciously hoof-like. As daylight shrank to a mere suggestion, any activity that filled the early sunset hours was welcomed like a miracle. Quilting bees, for instance, stitched more than just fabric. These gatherings were part textile production, part social lifeline, and part mildly competitive sport. Everyone knew that Widow Brewster could make a 9-patch quilt block faster than lightning, and while none would call it jealousy aloud, several women did mysteriously misplace her thimble more than once. Food remained a constant preoccupation, not least because the late winter pantry was a sparse, judgmental place. You'd open the root cellar door and be greeted by a half-frozen turnip and the ghost of sausages past. Thanks to careful rationing, and perhaps the fact that food simply refused to ripen outdoors in February, most families still had some preserves clinging on. Apples stored in barrels had shrunken slightly, as though they too had decided to hibernate. Dried beans sat unenthusiastically in their sacks, waiting to be boiled for the 7th time that week. And salted meat, that great salty saviour, remained the centrepiece of many meals, despite the fact that it now tasted suspiciously like firewood licked by regret. This, of course, is where ingenuity came in. People weren't just surviving, they were inventing tiny miracles of monotony mitigation. Leftover stew became thickened broth pie. Yesterday's hardened cornmeal might be grated into some sort of third-day pudding. Colonial kids learned from a young age that if you squint while chewing, anything can sort of taste like chicken. And while food was sustenance, it also masqueraded as currency. Not among the gentry, mind you, but in the quiet economy of neighbourly exchange. A pint of maple syrup might be traded for a few precious candles, or a small wheel of hard cheese for an afternoon of help rebinding the outhouse door, which had once again decided wind had stronger opinions about its placement. Religion, too, remained an ever-present layer, softly woven into the daily routine. Families prayed not just for salvation, but for the survival of next year's potato crop, the general health of goats, and that no one would drop dead before the maple sap started running again. Sunday church services were less about theological fervour in these months, and more about an acceptable excuse to sit beside a good fire that wasn't your own. And amid all the tallow-lit quiet, something remarkable began to happen. People leaned into stillness. With no crops to coax, and journeys scarce thanks to snow that swallowed boots, winter became a time of enforced reflection. Journal pages lengthened. Letters were written and rewritten before being sealed with wax and hope. Marriages were proposed beside smoky hearths over lukewarm cider, often with a touching lack of poetry but an abundance of sincerity. It was, rather unexpectedly, when the world was blanketed in white silence, that communities tended to look inward, not just into themselves, but into each other. And as the fire dimmed low once more and shadows stretched across the floorboards, folks would sigh, pull the quilts a little higher, and wonder aloud, would the sap run early this year? But that, dear listener, is something we'll explore just a bit further. As the first whispers of spring prepared to stir, snow flurried in fits and whispers, curling like steam above the rooftops of the tiny colonial hamlet. By now, winter had made itself entirely at home. Shoes off, feet on the hearth, helping itself to the pantry. It brought with it freezing winds, stubborn ice, and a curious knack for making even the bravest souls consider a second pair of woolen socks, or possibly a third. But if surviving the cold was an art, the colonists were equal parts painter and paint. They didn't merely endure winter, they bundled up, buttoned down, and steeped it like tea. And nowhere did this chilly artistry shine brighter than in the strange and savoury world of colonial winter cooking. Now, one might imagine colonial kitchens as cosy oases, warm hearths, steaming stews, contented hums, and one would be mostly right if one also pictured kitchen smoke behaving like an unruly poltergeist and porridge that could double as a building material. Winter was no time for culinary fancy. Ingredients were determined not by whim, but by what hadn't frozen, spoiled, or sprouted legs and declared independence. This meant root vegetables were kings, queens, and most of the nobility. Turnips, carrots, onions, and the ever-glamorous parsnip formed the base of everything hearty. Potatoes, those earthy treasures of the New World, had by now burrowed their way into the colonists' hearts and, more importantly, their diets. Inside drafty kitchens of timber and fieldstone, families gathered around open hearths, not out of sentiment, but because it was the only reliable source of heat, light, and something vaguely edible. Fires had to be stoked constantly, not too much to waste precious wood, but not too little unless one fancied licking raw squash at supper time. Stews were less a recipe and more a cauldron of possibility. Did you have a carrot? In it went. Some salted pork, tossed in. A mysterious lump possibly left over from last week. Best not dwell on it. Chop and stir. Many families kept a perpetual stew simmering for days, sometimes weeks. A culinary creature growing stranger with every spoonful. The flavor deepened over time, like a wise old man who had seen too much, smelled even more, and still held firm. And then there was hasty pudding, not as fast as it sounds. Made with cornmeal and boiled into a thick, gluey mush, it was the colonial equivalent of comfort food, if your idea of comfort was something that sits politely in your stomach and doesn't ask follow-up questions. Slathered in molasses or sweetened with apples when fortune allowed, it acted as winter culinary wallpaper, ever present, moderately interesting, and largely inoffensive. For drink, there was cider, sweet, hard, cold, warm, from apples picked in early autumn and hoarded like pearls in cellars. It was a safer bet than molasses thick pond water, and a modest cup could lull even the most anxious soul into a state of cozy stupor. Some opted for a hot posset, milk curdled with ale or sack wine, crowned with a drifting archipelago of spices, a bold blend that could make one feel celebratory or confused, sometimes both. Baking occurred sporadically when wood and flour lined up agreeably. Families would crowd around clay ovens or a cast-iron Dutch oven buried in embers. There might be coarse brown bread, more stone than slice, or gingerbread thick with treacle and hope. Occasionally, if hens were feeling generous and the cow hadn't frozen mid-moo, there'd even be a pudding, a genuine dessert, not just a repackaged breakfast in a deceptive bowl. And yes, there was meat, but sparingly, and dried, smoked, or salted beyond recognition. Summer's slaughtered hog was winter's bacon, ham, and lard. A properly larded biscuit could shine with winter's only gleam of decadence. Still, scarcity made everything sacred. Nothing wasted, nothing taken for granted, not even a humble rind of cheese. As the snow stacked up like white parchment at the windowsills, colonists huddled with their family, their fire, and their fare. Mealtimes became rituals, an offering to endurance, an ode to creative frugality. Each smoky mouthful told a story, not one of gourmet flourish, but of resourcefulness, habit, and the kind of stoic humor that grows when your bread tries to escape the pan sideways. Outside, the wind moaned like a door half open to another world. Inside, someone passed the porridge again, and with full bellies and soot-smudged smiles, these winter whisperers prepared for the next challenge of the season. A challenge less about food and more about navigating the strange and surprisingly social world of colonial winter gatherings. As the snow deepened and the temperatures sank toward degrees that could politely be described as offensively frigid, the ordinary folk of colonial America turned to one of their most time-honored survival techniques: vigorous doing nothing. And sleep. Lots and lots of sleep. Yes, dear listener, before there were fitness trackers and double-shot lattes, the winter rhythm of survival had a certain horizontal quality. Sleep schedules in the colonies during the coldest months bore little resemblance to the briskly scheduled lives of modern folk. Instead, they leaned into a tradition forgotten in our neon-lit age: the double sleep. Colonial humans, much like cats with complicated feelings, practiced a sleep pattern now known as segmented sleep. When evening fell, often before 6 p.m., people would take to their beds, burrowed in with wool-stuffed blankets, feather-stuffed pillows, and occasionally things that were formerly sheep. They'd sleep for 4 or 5 hours, awaken around midnight, and stay up for an hour or two, engaged in soft conversation, knitting, wood stove tending, or prayer. Then they'd drift again into a second sleep, waking with the pinkish promise of morning. Some even called it first sleep and second sleep, which feels both poetic and faintly hobbitish. This in-between time, even when temperatures indoors flirted with freezing, was a liminal hour of snacking on leftover porridge, perhaps paging through an almanac by candlelight, or exchanging whispers with one spouse under the blanket fortress you'd both constructed to keep out the frost. It was not insomnia, it was purposeful stillness, and it was as essential to winter survival as firewood or pickled cabbage. Meanwhile, outside the bedrooms and candles, winter kept doing what winter does best, refused to be reasonable. Snow would pile high against the sides of houses, sometimes so dense that householders had to shovel their way out through second-story windows. Chickens were cradled indoors for warmth and perhaps companionship. And root cellars became the colonial equivalent of a well-stocked refrigerator. If said refrigerator was a hole in the ground full of turnips with identity issues, and oh, the smells of those long nights. Imagine the mingling perfumes of beeswax, parsnip stew, singed wool, and perhaps a brave little onion curling around the hearth. That was the aroma of staying alive in January, 18th century style. To cope with the cold indoors, as central heating would not make an appearance for quite some centuries, people relied on their own bodies as portable furnaces. Sleeping in shifts became a solution for some, with one child or grandparent tossed like kindling onto the family bed whenever someone else got up to tend the coals. A big bed was a veritable village in winter, often shared by several people, especially in modest homes. It was as much about heat as it was about kinship, and occasionally, elbows to the ribs. Clothes weren't so much removed at bedtime as welded on. You might go weeks without peeling off your linen shift, or your wool gaiters, or your ambitions to someday not smell like smoked rutabaga. Colonists weren't dirty per se. They were simply practical. If your only bathing option involved breaking ice off a bucket, cleanliness became more of a seasonal aspiration. Still, amidst the freezing breath and frost-kissed windows, colonists crafted little sanctuaries. Quilts stuffed with oddments of fabric told stories of past harvests and mended lives. A chair scooted dangerously close to the hearth became a throne of warmth and reflection. Even a pot of beans simmering endlessly over a lazy flame might draw the family together, drawn not just by sustenance, but by the chance to simply wait out the cold together. So yes, winter was long, but in a way, it created the rarest of luxuries. Time to rest without guilt, to snore without schedule, to dream twice a night, and remember both sets in the morning. As February crept forward, with its icy fingers reaching toward March, these sleepy rituals, slow, steady, wrapped in wool and the occasional goose feather, held the soul together just as much as the food and firewood ever could. After all, in the quiet heart of winter, perhaps the most rebellious act of survival wasn't chopping wood or curing meat. It was choosing to rest. And with that gentle thought, we can carefully place another log onto the fire, let it crackle once more, and welcome the slow thaw that begins, not with the sunrise, but with the turn of the mind toward warmth. Soon, when we stir next, something curious will begin to happen just outside the windows, beneath deep snow and half-asleep roots. Somewhere between the frozen breath of January and the cautiously hopeful thaw of March, colonial New Englanders entered the mental twilight zone that was late winter. Not quite the dead of the season, but nowhere near the life of spring. It was a time of creaking floorboards, soupy porridge, and the sort of cabin-induced delirium that made arguing over how many beans were left in the sack a reasonable afternoon pastime. By this point in winter, food stores were thinner than a Puritan's sense of humor. Some families had enough potatoes left to do a modest jig of gratitude. Others, they were negotiating with the chickens. Yes, chickens. Those feathered aristocrats of the colonial backyard were winter royalty. Not so much for their companionship, though Lord Henry Peckleton III, the family rooster, surely believed otherwise, but for their ability to produce eggs even as the snow piled up outside, assuming of course they weren't frozen solid or staging a seasonal molting protest. Eggs, when you could get them, were small miracles. They brightened mushy cornmeal cakes and gave rise to the humble custard, which the colonists lovingly referred to as white gold in a spoon. Mind you, if they'd had actual gold, they probably would have preferred a hot fire and a London bakery. What they had instead were root vegetables, turnips, rutabagas, and parsnips, nature's cold weather consolation prize. They could last all winter in root cellars, waiting stoically in the dirt like tuberous hermits. By late February, however, even the most patient colonist was growing tired of parsnip stew. You could dress it up with a bit of dried sage or a sprinkle of old salt pork, but it still tasted mostly like defeat. Water, too, was a minor ordeal. With streams frozen and snow banks too full of mystery, snowmelt had to be collected, boiled, and strained with a cloth that once wished it remained a curtain. The daily ritual of melting snow on the hearth became a meditation of sorts, slow, steamy, and vaguely therapeutic, like the world's least efficient spa day. Inside their cabins, people padded about in woolen layers that may not have been washed since the last harvest moon. The air was heavy with the musk of wool smoke and whatever food had most recently tried to boil over. The walls shook when the wind howled, and every creak of timber was scrutinized, lest some ghost of winter's past come tumbling through the eaves. To combat the gloom spiraling through their drafty little lives, colonists turned to their most precious commodity after food and firewood, stories, told by flickering firelight passed from grandmother to scruffy child, tales spun of winter beasts, heroic suppers, and long vanished springs. No story was too grim or too ridiculous. If it made you laugh, or even sigh in a distracted fashion, it was golden. There were also riddles. Riddles about animals, riddles about God, riddles about why the ale kept freezing in the mug by the door. Here's a favourite whispered during many a snowbound night. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 once it's slipped on ice, twisted a knee, and needs an extra stick? The answer, of course, is Grandpa Jonathan, who insisted on going out just to check the chickens. For children, winter was both a chill and a thrill. When not made to churn butter or mend sock holes the size of a raccoon's head, some lucky young ones could sled down nearby hills on crude wooden boards greased with tallow, an activity that was equal parts exhilarating and deeply unsafe. The braver ones even attempted ice skating, using animal bones lashed to their shoes. It was less figure skating and more praying for balance while resembling a startled deer, but joy is in the attempt. The days were slow but the world kept turning. Tallow candles burned lower. The ink in letters home started to freeze in its pot. Yet still, they made it through, day by day, turnip by turnip, story by sleepy story. The shadows grew a little shorter come March, the snow a little less stubborn on the south side of the cabin. And so, slowly, wrapped in raggedy wool and armed with stubborn cheer, they inched towards spring. Eventually, it would come. The melting snow, the first stubborn sprouts, the rooster crowing at an hour even it wasn't sure of. But we're nearly there now. Just one more flicker of this candle. One more gentle hush through the timber walls. One more story before the last frost sighs away. By the time the hearth embers faded into soft islands of red-orange in a sea of ash, the long colonial winter had begun to loosen its grip. No announcement was made. No calendar reminder. Just subtleties. The way the icicles gave up dripping grudgingly by afternoon. The creaking wood of cabin walls that did not seem quite as desperate. And the furtive optimism of a squirrel seen at noon. Most colonists didn't have much in the way of spring rituals, unless you count not freezing to death a ritual, which frankly it was. After months of scraping the last potato from the cellar's wooden bin, weeks of gnawing bacon ends with the contemplative pace of a poet writing his final stanza. Spring was nothing short of a miracle. Slightly muddy, deeply wet, and wholeheartedly miraculous. By March, anyone with 2 spoons to rub together conducted what we might today call the glorious pantry audit. That entailed staring balefully at the shelves and considering whether pickled turnip brine could, perhaps with a supernatural amount of optimism, pass for soup. Yet, despite the hardship, these winter survivors didn't exactly collapse into fields of daisies, largely because the fields were still half frozen and casually menacing. No, they got to work. First came chores with fancy names like mending the fence and unfreezing the cow. Okay, nobody called it that exactly, but let's just say the cows weren't frolicking until someone chipped at the water trough for half an hour with a blunt hatchet and a deeply unfriendly expression. People emerged from cabins like sleepy bears from dens, pale from smoky interiors but fortified with the stubborn pride of the undeterred. Children were dusted off and sent to fetch livestock, their footprints the first hopeful dents in the snow-patched mud. The weary winter clothes were hung outdoors, cloaks and breeches ghosting on the line with a tragic dignity. A colonial fashion show hosted by the wind. Everyone began to swap winter legends with the flair of survivors. Tales of the week when the snow piled so high they had to tunnel to the outhouse. Or the infamous moment when the flour ran out and someone tried to bake biscuits from dried corn husks and eternal sadness. Food, as always, was pivotal. The root cellars, those sanctuaries of wrinkled carrots and jars that looked suspect but made it through, were inventoried with grim reverence. The women of the house counted jars like a gambler at the last table of the night, hopeful, skeptical, full of muttered numbers. And yet, there was joy. There was communal bread once flour shipments returned. And oh, the triumph in tearing a fresh, leavened loaf after months of unleavened philosophy disguised as hardtack. There were eggs that made surprise appearances. Hen eggs that, like moody artists, declined to perform all winter, but returned flamboyantly with the sun. There were bovine reunions too. Milk so fresh it practically mooed in the pail, sending children into fits of jubilation and cows into states of mild irritation. Some towns even held informal thaw feasts, where neighbors gathered to share what survived the winter pantry. Think half-assaulted ham, 3 pickled beets, and a wilted but triumphant cabbage. The true feast, of course, was company. Humans laughing again, not just muttering at the fire or glaring at snowshoes. The longer, brighter days brought relief and a flurry of humble projects. Garden beds stirred back to life, fences reset like colonial hope itself, and new boots mended for honest mudslogging. By the time the frogs began to hum their spring opera in the marshes, there was a certain peace among the people. Surviving a colonial winter wasn't about emerging victorious. It was about emerging at all, slightly thinner perhaps, infinitely sootier, but alive, buzzing with the quiet defiance of those who outlasted cold winds and colder turnips. And as foxes yawned in thickets and sheep blinked lazily in the newfound warmth, the colonial homesteads hummed once more, not just with necessities, but with a sense of beginning. And you, dear listener, tucked under 21st century blankets and free from the tyranny of frozen cabbages, can let your eyes drift gently shut. You've earned a little rest. The hearth is low, the room is warm, and for now, the winter is done.